Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is going to go back to the Jews of Czarist Russia in the 19th century, but this time we're going to do something a little bit out of left field, a little bit different of a story, interesting and sometimes overlooked, the story of non-Ashkenazi Jews in Czarist Russia outside of the Pale of Settlement, Bukharian Jews, Georgian Jews, Mountain Jews, and others. But before we get to that, the last episode which we had, which was quite some time ago, I think nearly a month ago, was about the history of machine matzah and the controversy surrounding machine matzah, and I got tons of feedback and corrections. In fact, it's one of the most feedbacked episodes I've ever had, so I guess it was a wildly popular episode. So if you haven't heard it yet, you may want to check it out. I'm still getting feedback from it, but also some important corrections. So before I get to today's episode, I want to go through some of those, and I was hesitant to do so because it was such a long time ago and people have forgotten about it already. But I figured that since it's Pesach Sheni this week, we can do some matzah-related corrections and feedback. First of all, I did not give credit where credit is due to the one who published that book that I was discussing about the history of machine matzah. I should have, and I apologize for neglecting to do so. Yisrael Tress was the one who published it and gathered the material and spent quite some time working on the book, so I want to give him the credit. The second correction I want to make is that I announced at the outset of the episode about the machine matzah controversy that I would try to remain unbiased and try to remain balanced between the two sides. And it was pointed out to me by several listeners that I was unsuccessful in doing so, and that I showed my colors and my bias towards machine matzah. And therefore I want to apologize for that. I guess it was inevitable, and I guess I should have been more honest that I will be biased, or at least at the end of the episode said, I should have said, well, I tried, but it didn't work out, something along those lines. I did get some great feedback. I asked the audience, the listeners, to share with me any stories especially about the Litvish stance on the history of machine matzah, pro or anti, and I got some good stories. One listener submitted the following. He said, Rabbi Reisman of Far Rockaway always tells of his first Pesach by his father-in-law, Rabbi Mordechai Gifter. Rabbi Reisman came with his Hungarian gebakt hand matzah in tow, and his new father-in-law informed him that he can sit by himself with his matzahs, as in the Gifter home they ate machine matzah only. Another listener submitted a story that Rav Elia Svei was once visiting Israel for Pesach, or he was maybe there for the whole year, I don't know. He was there for some time, and he spent the Seder by his Rebbe, Reb Aaron Kotler's father-in-law, Rebbe Zalman Meltzer. And Rebbe Zalman Meltzer informed him that they only eat machine matzah also, and they should not bring his hand matzah with him. Another listener pointed out that I should have mentioned that despite the fact that the Divrei Chaim and the Shalom Eshiv had this halachic dispute regarding machine matzah, but I should have mentioned that they were in fact very close and had a reverence for each other. The most important mistake that I need to correct about the machine matzah is that I was so excited that I had found a source that no one else did, and I proudly announced it on the podcast very pompously, that I said that I found in the Sefer Emes Ve'emunah of the Kotzker that the Kotzker said something about machine matzah, that despite the fact that he could not find any halachic basis for its prohibition, but that means that there must be some sort of mystical reason, and therefore it is still forbidden to eat. And I was so excited about this mitzvah, and I should not have been excited because it was pointed out to me that I simply misquoted that Kotzker in the Sefer Emes Ve'emunah, and after all that I thought I found a source that no one else had found. In fact, the reason no one else found it is because I was misquoting it, and I should therefore be more circumspect in the future when I pretend to have found a source that no one else found. Because in fact, what it says there, and I should have double-checked this, was that the Kotzker was talking about gebruchts, not machine matzah. He was talking about the prohibition regarding eating gebruchts in Hasidic circles, and he said that he found no halachic basis for its prohibition, and yet despite the fact he said there must be some sort of mystical reason to prohibit gebruchts, and therefore it should still not be eaten. So the Kotzker was talking about gebruchts, and not discussing machine matzah. My favorite submission, and I want to end off the machine matzah saga with this story, is that another listener submitted a story with Reb Shlomka Zviller, which is also one of my favorite characters, huge tzaddik who lived for many years in Yerushalayim, later on in life. The story that this listener kindly and graciously shared was that there was a grandson, Tzugakumen, married-in grandson, someone who married Reb Shlomka Zviller's daughter, his granddaughter, and he was spending his first Pesach by Reb Shlomka Zviller, and his parents ate machine matzah, and of course Reb Shlomka Zviller did not eat machine matzah, so he wasn't sure what to do. So he asked Reb Shlomka Zviller, what should he do? The new Zayda. And the Heilige Zviller Rebbe said to him as follows. He said, and I'm translating it because the guy submitted it in Hebrew. He said, do you think they'll ask you in heaven if you ate machine matzah or hand matzah? You'll be asked if you were careful with your eyes from gazing at forbidden things, and if you were careful with your mouth so as not to hurt another Jew. But they will not be asking you about machine matzah or hand matzah. And I think we'll end off with that. And now let's get into today's episode regarding non-Ashkenazi Jews living in Czarist Russia in the 19th century. So we have, like I said, there's different types. There's Bukharian, Georgian. Some of them are similar to Sephardic communities. Bukharian was definitely influenced by Sephardic custom. Georgian less so. Mountain Jews also not. But all three are really not Sephardic communities. They're on their own. They're Bukharian Jews, Georgian Jews, and Mountain Jews. And there was a few other smaller communities. There was some elements of Sephardic influence at certain times, but they really stand on their own merits. The truth of the matter is that the Georgian, Bukharian, and Mountain Jews can each have an entire episode devoted to their entire fascinating history, because these are ancient communities and way off the beaten track. And like I said, they're outside of Ashkenazi and pretty much Sephardic Jewish tradition as well. And maybe we'll hopefully get to it one day. But in the context of this episode, I just want to focus on their experience under the Czars. That's it, the 19th and early 20th centuries. How does the Czars get there? The Tsarist Russian Empire has a series of wars with the Ottoman Empire, and without getting too much into the military history and conquest there, but these wars take place in the 18th and early 19th centuries, down to the mid-19th century, and there's quite a series of campaigns in which the expansionist imperial Russian Empire continuously battles and generally is victorious over the Ottoman Empire, which is past its golden age, past its prime, and therefore they keep on conquering these areas further south. The reason the Russians are doing that is because both of the general idea of European imperial expansion in the 19th century, so there's this philosophy of expansion. There's also it's a richly in natural resources, oil, and all kinds of other things. So there's this endeavor of the Czars to expand south, and it's mostly south into Central Asia, into the Middle East to a certain extent also. Not really down into the Middle East, but Southern and Central Asia, we'll call it. So there are Jewish communities in these areas. So when they're conquered from the Ottoman Empire, or from different Muslim entities, not just the Ottoman Empire, different Muslim princes and kinds of things like that, emirs, I think sometimes they're called. There's these ancient Jewish communities who live there for sometimes thousands of years. And they now fall under Tsarist Russian jurisdiction. So the number of Jews in those areas we're talking about is in the tens of thousands at its peak under the Czars. So it's relatively not huge by comparison. So if we say, well, how come I never heard of these Jewish communities or don't know much about them? So don't be that surprised, because they're not that large. They're rather small, especially compared to the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, who by the end of the 19th century were about 5 million Jews. So here there's a few tens of thousands in these areas. But it's still a good story, especially if we talk about how they lived under the Czars, which is a really cool story. Now, all of these areas are not in the Pale of Settlement. That's why this is such an interesting story. So now you have Jews in Russia under the legal jurisdiction of the Czars, and they're not in the Pale of Settlement because they never lived in the Pale of Settlement. So what's the legal classification of these Jews? That's one angle to examine. That's going to be the primary story that I want to delve into because I find it a very interesting story, more nuanced and changes our view of things a little bit. Another part of this story is the fact that these areas were Muslim majority areas. Georgia was Christian, but the mountain Jews and for sure the Bukharian Jews lived in Muslim areas. The Georgian church was different than the Russian Orthodox Church, so that was another issue to deal with. But as far as the Muslims, so these are Muslims coming into the Russian Empire. First of all, what was the Jewish-Muslim relationship under the Czars? With the Czars on top, how did the Jews and Muslims get along in Central Asia? And number two, how did the Czars view the Muslims? They're not Christian. They're not Russian Orthodox. Was there discrimination? In other words, do they treat them like they treat Jews? Do they treat them differently? So that's another question worth asking. One of the most well-known stories of these areas is the fact that there were Jews from the Pale who either settled in these areas, Ashkenazi Jews from the Pale who settled in the areas of Georgia, of Bukhara, of less so in the mountain areas, but a little bit also. Especially well known is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, starting with the Tzemach Tzedek, and later on it continued. So the Rebbe Rashab, and in between, they essentially are sending shluchim. It's interesting because we assume shluchim is a phenomenon of the 20th century in Chabad. It's not true. The Lubavitcher Rebbe's in the 19th century in Russia sent shluchim also to various places. One of those places was down into Georgia and other communities. They called them sometimes these agricultural areas in the southern Pale of Settlement and even further south into Georgia, southeast into Georgia. I never know if it's Georgia or Georgia because I don't want it to sound like we're talking about Atlanta here or Savannah. We're talking about a country called Georgia. I think it's pronounced Georgia, or let's just call it Georgia to differentiate from the state in the southern United States, because I keep on saying South and Georgia. So I'm not talking about the state of Georgia in the southern United States. I'm talking about the country of Georgia in now it's a country south of Russia, but in those days it was part of the Czarist Russian Empire. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe sends these shluchim there to kolonias, they're called, these agricultural settlements, first in the southern Pale of Settlement and also into Georgia. Recently, my writing collaborator, colleague, and dear friend Davi Safir and I wrote a tribute in the Mishpacha magazine. Not recently, it might have been even half a year ago, I don't remember how long ago it was, about Rabbi Svilio Henkin, and we delved into the story of his rabbinate in Georgia. He actually was a rabbi there. So you see, rabbis, Rabbi Henkin was from Slutsk. There were Ashkenazi Rabbanim from the Pale who ended up down in Georgia. So the Ashkenazi migration to those areas is another angle of the story that we're going to want to discuss. Gosh, I can't even talk anymore. In any event, if we would want to get ahead of our story, then there's also the fascinating story of Jews in these areas during the time of the Soviet Union, when Jews escape there or are exiled there for doing the terrible crime of spreading religion and Judaism. So many times Jews are exiled to Samarkand or Tashkent or other parts, and there's heroic stories of Chabad rabbis or other Jews being sent there and sustaining the light of Yiddishkeit and of Judaism under the Soviet Union. In the communists, this becomes one of those strange quirks of history that it ends up Samarkand becomes this area that under the communists somehow Tomchei Tamimim and things like that are able to survive underground. That's another story. And another story is the Holocaust. Does the Holocaust reach Georgia? Does it reach Azerbaijan, the mountain Jews areas? Does it reach Bukhara? There are Jews who escape from Russia to these areas to survive the Holocaust. So there's these huge Jewish communities in exile thousands and thousands of Jews who escaped to the internal areas of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, and these parts, Central Asia, which are in the Soviet Union, that escaped the Nazis and lived there for several years. Those two stories, Jews in the Soviet Union and Central Asia, and the Holocaust in Central Asia, or escaping the Holocaust in Central Asia, those two stories are very interesting ones, but they are not part of our story today. They are post-Czarist Russia. So hopefully we'll get to that one day as well. Let's go through them one by one, since they're very different communities and stories, so we can't really bunch them all together. Let's start with what's known as Bukharian Jewry under the Czars, and that will be our primary focus today, much less, if any, we'll see if we have time, on the mountain and Georgian Jewish communities. I just happen to be more familiar with the Bukharian Jewish community and its history, or only its history. So I'm not in any way trying to minimize the narrative of Georgian and mountain Jews, but the focus will be on Bukharian Jews. So first of all, I want to get just over because for me it was a little bit unfamiliar when I started out with the research, the geography itself, just a brief overview of Jews of Central Asia, geographically. Which areas or countries are we referring to when we speak about the Jews of Central Asia? So the countries of Georgia and Azerbaijan, that's the ones we're talking to. They're south of Russia. Turkey is just to the west, and Iran is just to the south. And Iran, or Persian Jewry, actually has a decisive impact on the development of all these Russian non-Ashkenazi Jewish communities, as we'll see. We're also talking about countries such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan. These countries are north of Iran, north of Pakistan, north of India, and north of China. So they run along this perimeter, what we refer to as Central Asia. Now, if these countries sound odd or strange or bizarre, but many people are more familiar with some of the cities in these countries, and there are two reasons for this. Like I said before, during World War II, many Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian Jewish refugees fled to the interior of the Soviet Union, where they survived the war, generally under quite adverse conditions, but it was a method of survival far from the Nazi occupation and the final solution. So you may have heard your grandparents or reading books about Jews who escaped to these places during the Second World War. The other reason that some of these cities might sound familiar is that during the communist era, as I mentioned before, many Russian Soviet Jews, Babich Hasidim and others, were either exiled to these areas or ended up there when they struggled to maintain a Jewish existence. These stories and cities are especially prominent in the annals of Chabad Lubavitch history and served a prominent role in the history of Chabad in the Soviet Union and the struggle to maintain Jewish life under the communists. Cities such as Samarkand, Tashkent, and Bukhara in Uzbekistan, or Jambul or Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, and several other cities as well. So these two stories, as fascinating as they are sub-narratives of the Holocaust and are sub-narratives of the Jews in the Soviet Union. So they're beyond our discussion of Jews in Tsarist Russia, as I mentioned. So we're going to focus on the Jews in these areas under the Czars, both the native as well as the Ashkenazi Pale of Settlement Jews who migrated there one way or another. In this context, it's worth noting that that those Ashkenazi Jews who settled there, which we'll speak about, there were two types. There's the majority who settled there because they were allowed to live out of the Pale of Settlement, and therefore they tended to be less religious, less traditional, less committed to to traditional observance. But like I said, but the Chabad Shluchim, who essentially began here, because the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek in the mid-19th century sent many of his followers to what was referred to as the colonies, the kolonias in southern Russia, very often agricultural settlements, but also to the cities. This was not only in southern Ukraine, but also to Georgia and Azerbaijan, which is quite an interesting story too, because it was kind of doing kiruv. It was Jewish outreach among these far-flung Jewish communities in the mid-19th century, because as we'll see, the isolation of the Georgian mountain and Bukharian Jewish communities led it to having a less of a commitment, or strong commitment, not less of a commitment, but a less of a strong Jewish educational system, we'll say, strong rabbinical presence. So there was a Jewish outreach there. Hillel Paritcher was a very famous Lubavitcher Chassid who emerged as a kind of mini Rebbe in his own right. He's right in the center of this story, but again, I digress. So getting back to Bukharian Jewry under the Czars. It's an ancient Jewish community. The Bukharian Jewish community is at least 2,000 years old, perhaps longer. In the modern era, it was influenced largely by a migration of Iranian Jews, Persian Jews, who migrated north into Bukhara. And the community's culture and customs were very similar to Persian Jews. Central Asia, like I said, was a Muslim region, and therefore the Jews in Bukhara adopted the culture, customs, language, dress, and other mannerisms of their Muslim surroundings. As in all Muslim lands and countries, so non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindu, Buddhists, whatever, were all considered infidels, and therefore they sustained all sorts of discriminatory practices and limitations, and the Jews here in Bukhara were no exception. Second-class citizens, they were considered what's referred to in Islamic law as dhimmi, or a tolerated status. That's in Bukhara. By the way, in Georgia, which was more Christian, was an exception. In fact, hopefully we'll get to it, but just in case we don't, I'll give you the scoop now. Georgia is studied, the Georgian Jewish community is studied by scholars of the history of anti-Semitism, because the axiom of there's always anti-Semitism, and every country the Jews have been in, there has always suffered anti-Semitism at some point, is simply does not stand to scrutiny, and the best example of it is Georgia. There was, for 2,000 years, the Jewish community in Georgia, there was basically no anti-Semitism until the Czars took over the area in the early 1800s. Hopefully we'll get to that soon. But once the Czars came to the area, there was anti-Semitism, there was blood libels, there was sisi v'simchi, there was plenty of anti-Semitism. But before the Czars, the Georgian Jewish community existed for 2,000 years with zero known instances of anti-Semitism. So that's an interesting story of Georgia. But Jews in Bukhara, they were a dhimmi or tolerated status, which I'm not sure if we'll attribute to anti-Semitism or not, because it was for all infidels, all non-Muslims. Either way, Jews there spoke the language, but with their own unique dialect of the local language. They engaged in polygamy, just like the majority Muslim population. So this contributed to lots of the fact that they were second-class citizens and they were discriminated against contributed to lots of internal cohesion, a very sophisticated Jewish communal infrastructure, institutions, religious life. Bukharian Jewry emerged as a somewhat isolated but a very proud Jewish community of Central Asia, spread over large swaths of territory in many cities and villages. That's before the Czarist takeover. In 1821, a Russian scouting report assessed the area in preparation for a Russian imperial conquest of the Bukharian region, and that report, which we have, noted the Jewish presence in the Bukharian lands. That report, this Russian report, states that in 1821 there's approximately 4,000 Jews living in Bukhara, and that they assumed, the Russian report assumed that the Jews of Bukhara would be receptive to a Russian conquest since they suffered at the hands of the Muslim majority. Interestingly enough, Bukharian Jews were relatively better off than their brethren in neighboring Afghanistan and Iran. Yet, they still anticipated that the Russian conquest would bring an improvement to their legal and political and economic status. Now, it's unclear if at this point they were at all aware or had any significant contact with Russian Jewry in the Pale. What is clear is that the Tsarist Russian conquest of the Bukharian region took place in stages in the 1860s, between 1864 and 1868. In other words, much later than the Georgia and Mountain Jews, who were under Russian jurisdiction for nearly half a century at this point, because the Russian Empire conquered the areas of Georgia and Azerbaijan, where the Mountain Jews lived, in the early 1800s. So Bukhara fell under Russian jurisdiction much later, relatively, than the others. Also, the Georgia and Mountain Jews resided in areas that were relatively near the Pale of Settlement. At times, parts of Georgia were even part of the Pale of Settlement. but the Jews of Bukhara were geographically much further from the Pale of Settlement. All these things obviously are going to have ramifications on the trajectory of their history under the Czars. There's other differences too. Bukharian Jewry openly supported the Czarist military conquest. Fascinating. And I guess that's how bad it was under the previous Islamic regime, or perhaps it's possible that they were not fully aware it was going to be under a potential Tsarist regime, or alternatively, the Bukharian Jews were very aware, but they were familiar with the great reforms of Tsar Alexander II. Remember, this takes place in the 1860s during the peak of the great reforms of Tsar Alexander II, and perhaps the Bukharian Jews saw that as a positive direction. Then a crucial piece of the story is as follows. The Bukharian areas that are conquered by the Tsar are divided into two zones. One is a zone under direct Russian occupation. In other words, it's annexed to the territory of the Russian Empire, and therefore under the direct jurisdiction of the Tsarist government. Another territory of Bukhara, autonomy is granted to the local ruling class, to the Muslim ruling class, as it always had been, with the Russian control being more external in nature. More about natural resources and taxes, but not internal governance. This was a treaty that they reached between the rulers of Bukhara. So Bukhara is essentially divided in half. This divided method of Russian control of the area would have ramifications for the respective Jewish communities in the region in rather surprising ways. Because following their conquest of Central Asia, the Russian imperial government granted equal rights and freedom of religion to all native residents of the region, including Jews, making them for the first time in history equal to Muslims, which was a significant change for the better than their previous status. And now that causes some level of resentment by the Muslim majority. So what ultimately was the result of this legislation was an extraordinary situation, whereas the native Jews of Samarkand and Tashkent and the surrounding areas, which fell under direct Russian occupation, had more freedom and equal rights than the other Bukharian Jews who remained under the previous Islamic internal autonomous government under the agreement reached with the Russian conquest, where the Jews remained second-class citizens under Muslim rule and restricted in many ways by the Muslim majority rulership. And like I said, the Samarkand and Tashkent Bukharian Jews enjoyed more freedom and equal rights. They also enjoyed more freedom and equal rights, and this is another irony, than the Ashkenazi Jews of Russia, because the laws of the Pale of Settlement and all the accompanying restrictive legislative measures regarding the Ashkenazi Jews of Russia did not apply to the Bukharian Jewish community, which had just come under Russian control in the 1860s in Central Asia. So the Jews living under direct Russian occupation in Tashkent and Samarkand in the 1860s and on were better off than the other Jews of Bukhara still living under the Muslims, and they're also better off than the Ashkenazi Jews of Russia who had all the restrictions of the Pale and everything else. So they were in a pretty good situation. Now, why was this so? What happened? Why was the Tsar so benevolent to the Jews of Bukhara under their direct control? So let's try to explain. The Jewish community in Bukhara cooperated to a great extent with the Russian conquest, even prior to the conquest itself, and even to the extent that they actively fought with the Russians against the Muslim army. Fascinating. The Bukharian Jews in the territory under direct Russian control was seen by the Russian imperial government, from their point of view, as a natural ally, because the Muslim majority was viewed by the Russian imperial government as untrustworthy and resentful towards the Russian conquerors, but the Bukharian Jews were not, because they were discriminated against by the Muslims. The Bukharian Jews were seen as the bridge between the Russian government and the local population and potential key players in the economic development of the region. So it was really imperial strategic planning and policy which granted the native Jews of Bukhara more rights and freedom. Due to this crucial factor and to the subsequent rapid economic development and industrialization of the newly conquered region, many Bukharian Jews from the Muslim-controlled areas migrated to the Bukharian area under Russian Tsarist control, which augmented the Jewish population there quite significantly. Samarkand alone had a Jewish population of about 10,000 by the revolution. Many of those Jews, Bukharian Jews, who migrated there from areas of Bukhara which were still under Muslim control, when they had been under Muslim control, they had been forcibly converted to Islam under that Islamic regime. And now that they migrated to the area of Bukhara, to Tashkent and Samarkand, which was under Czarist control, they were now free to return to their Jewish faith when immigrating to the territory under Tsarist Russia. The irony here is wild. It's so fascinating. The Jewish migration to Bukhara from the autonomous Muslim-controlled to the Russian-controlled was so large that the Muslim authorities complained to the Tsarist authorities to put a stop to it because there was this loss of revenue from taxes and other things. The Jewish communal structure in the Bukharian region was traditional. They had schools and shuls and rabbis. Their rabbis were recognized by the Tsar's government. Their internal kahal structure remained as before and even improved due to the fact that they were now not considered second-class citizens relative to the Muslim population. Under Muslim law, they were not permitted to construct new shuls. And then under the new Russian administration, they received the license to build new shuls. So a spring of new shul construction commenced as well. The kahal internal tax structure did not change. And in fact, because of the improved economic situation, so the increased revenue enabled them to develop their communal infrastructure. New schools, orphanages, soup kitchens, mikvahs, other institutions. The Bukharian Jews had both traditional cheder type of schools as well as modern schools, which incorporated general studies as well. And I want to point out, there was no haskalah in Bukhara. So why were they so modernizing their schools? It's because of something that I'm obsessed with and I always talk about, because modernity and secularization and incorporating elements of modernity into Jewish communities has very little, if anything, to do with haskalah. It has to do with external exposure to modernity from the outside world, not from internal Jewish issues, as I always claim. And this is yet another example, but this is a huge topic, and I keep on getting back to it, and maybe I'll have a few episodes on it in the future. In any event, the Bukharian Jews continue to speak in their unique Jewish dialect of the region, but many learned Russian as well. Although the level of literacy was significantly lower than Ashkenazi Russian Jews, but Bukharian Jews had a generally higher level of literacy than the local Muslim population of Central Asia. The improved economic prosperity and demographic growth and improved transportation and communications, building of railroads, due to the Russian conquest, led to another very significant development of the Bukharian Jewish community in a spiritual sense. A very strong connection to Eretz Yisrael, because now it's easier to get to. They weren't as isolated as they were before for centuries. Fundraisers from the Sephardic Old Yishuv began to come with greater frequency to Bukhara to raise money. Some of them stayed for long periods of time. Occasionally they stayed permanently, and these were great rabbis and scholars from Eretz Yisrael, and they had a large impact on the spiritual growth of the Bukharian Jewish community. And it's worth noting in this context that due to its relative isolation for centuries, the level of Jewish practice and knowledge was extremely low until these emissaries and rabbis and other spiritual leaders. The truth is that they already started arriving in the 18th century before the Russian conquest, but it continued into the 19th century, and it wasn't only from the land of Israel. There was a famous rabbi from Morocco who came in the 18th century. He's considered the one who revived the spiritual life of Bukharian Jewry in the 18th century. There's also rabbis who came from Persia, Iran, Baghdad, and Eretz Yisrael. So as a result, there was a strong and perhaps decisive Sephardic influence in religious halachic practice and custom. So it overshadowed the non-Sephardic ethnic origins of Bukharian Jewry, which is a big topic for another time. What makes a community Sephardic? Is it their race? They have to actually descend from exiles from the Spanish expulsion of 1492, or if the community follows the halachic practice and customs of Sephardic Jewry because of rabbis who came there and had an influence on the community, does that make them Sephardic? And the nafkamina, so to speak, would be a place like Bukhara, which ethnically is not Sephardic at all, but they have this influence in the 18th and 19th centuries from Morocco, from Iran, and from Baghdad, and from the land of Israel, which influences the spiritual halachic practice of the community, making it more Sephardic. The establishment of the Bukharian neighborhood, the Bukharian quarter in Yerushalayim, outside of the old city walls, in 1890, has a positive impact on Bukharian Jewry back in Bukhara, because this supplies rabbinic leadership, education, Sfarim, language. This neighborhood in Yerushalayim today many are familiar with because it's in between Mir Yeshiva and Beis Yisrael and the Geula neighborhood. So it's right there. Many people know that area. But this Bukharian neighborhood essentially became the spiritual center of Bukharian Jewry, maintaining strong ties with Bukhara. Most importantly, they printed Sfarim in the Bukharian language for the first time in history, which had a very positive and long-term impact on the community's spiritual, educational, and general development. In 1910, the first Bukharian Jewish language newspaper, named the Rachamim, in Hebrew letters, but in the Bukharian language, was published in Bukhara. It was seemingly influenced by Ashkenazi Jews who had settled in Bukhara. More on that soon. It's a big story. And it was printed regularly and read in the community as a weekly until 1916. Another interesting factor that set Bukharian Jewry apart from Ashkenaz Jews in the Pale of Settlement and beyond was their exemption from the Russian military draft for some reason. The Tsar did not draft Bukharian Jews into the army, despite the fact that they were considered subjects of the Russian Empire. This continued until 1916. During World War I, 200 Bukharian Jews were drafted into the war economy labor brigades and factories, and they proudly served and were generally more patriotic to the Tsar than the local Muslim population. Most Bukharian Jews found employment in the various stages of the textile industry, cotton, factories, and also a little bit of agriculture, music, singing, poetry, including Jewish women who rose prominently in the field. Interestingly enough, in this context, it's worth mentioning that mountain Jews as well were very musically gifted, and music and song had been a traditional mode of expression for many centuries in mountain Jewish communities. Interesting. In fact, once we're speaking about mountain Jews, I digress again. So the two most distinctive features of mountain Jews were its militaristic tradition. They were fighters, which may sound surprising, and it's music. This is mountain Jews, not Bukharian Jews. In fact, until today, a disproportionate number of senior officers in the IDF and singers in Israel are descendants of mountain Jews, which is fascinating. In any event, getting back to Bukhara, the next big topic, and an interesting one at that, is the Ashkenazi Jews from the Pale of Settlement migrating to Bukhara, their status there, and their relationship with the local Jewish community. First thing to note is that officially this region was outside of the Pale of Settlement. So Ashkenazi Jews were prohibited from residing there. So officially, only those with legal permits based on military service or profession or wealth that we discussed in previous episodes were permitted to reside in Bukhara. Although there were those there who resided illegally. Both legal and illegal residents were constantly concerned about being deported from Bukhara back to the Pale, which occasionally took place. Ashkenazi Jews primarily settled in urban centers such as Samarkand and Tashkent. Many Ashkenazi Jews who migrated there worked in the printing, publishing, and newspaper industry. Most were not religious, though some, notably Chabad Hasidim, as I mentioned, were and had a very positive influence on religious life among both the Ashkenazi and Bukharian communities there. So there soon emerged three Jewish communities in the Bukharian cities. The largest and oldest were the native Bukharian Jews, now in the Czarist Russian Empire. The next were traditional and religious Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, who migrated there from the Pale and established their own Ashkenazi communities and did not mix much, if at all, with the local Bukharian community. In fact, there was a little bit of animosity between the two. In fact, if we mention again the Georgian Jewish community, so Ashkenazi Jews who moved to Georgia had almost nothing to do with Georgian Jews, and there was distrust. Georgian Jews considered the Ashkenazim who moved to Georgia to be secular, non-practicing Jews, because most of them were, so they disregarded them because the Georgian Jews were quite religiously observant. And the Russian Ashkenazi Jews who moved to Georgia considered the Georgian native Jews to be primitive. So the two had nothing to do with each other, and there's a lot of animosity. So that's a reality as well. Plus, we'll add, they didn't speak the same language. Some of them both spoke Russian, some Georgian and Ashkenazi Jews spoke Russian, but Yiddish was the language of most Ashkenazi Jews, and the Georgian language and dialect was the language of the Georgian Jews, and therefore they couldn't even communicate with each other. Going back to Bukhara, the third Jewish community was the secular and even assimilated Jews who resided in the European or Russian neighborhoods of the Bukharian cities and did not even attach themselves to any Jewish communal structure altogether. The extent that the Ashkenazi newcomers distanced themselves from the native Bukharian Jews is best expressed in prayer custom. Prior to the construction of their own Ashkenazi shuls, the Ashkenazi traditional Jews who moved to Bukhara davened in the Bukharian Jews, but they made a point of facing a different direction just to show that they're different. Even after they built their own shuls and communal infrastructure, they maintained this separation. And for example, in Tashkent, the Ashkenazi shul was built right across the street from the Bukharian shul, but the Ashkenazi shul again made a point of facing a different direction for prayer. And the shul was designed that way, to differentiate themselves from the Bukharian shul. A fascinating quirk in history between Russia and Bukhara gives us a rare insight into Jewish immigration trends, which is my personal pet peeve and favorite subject, immigration, Jewish immigration in the modern era. Surprisingly so, because I barely talk about it. But it is a microcosm and provides a window to a much broader phenomenon in Jewish history. What is this story? Towards the end of the 19th century, a new trend emerged. As we mentioned earlier, some areas of Bukhara remained under the original Muslim autonomous control and governance with a treaty with the Czarist government, whereas other areas of Bukhara were under direct Russian control and jurisdiction, and with the Russian legislation pertinent to those areas. We also mentioned how the Bukharian Jewish community under direct Tsarist control benefited from the regime change, as their economic, religious, and civil freedoms were greatly expanded under Russian control relative to the Muslim legislation until that time. As a result, as we've previously mentioned, there was a steady stream of immigration to the Russian areas of Bukhara from the Muslim-controlled areas of Bukhara. That we all said before. Having said that, we return to the Ashkenazim who migrated to the Russian areas of Bukhara towards the end of the 19th century that I just mentioned. Even if they were there in Bukhara legally, because it was outside the Pale, and especially if they were there illegally outside of the Pale of settlement, their situation in Bukhara was precarious at worst and limited at best. If they didn't migrate, but if they would migrate across this semi-border to the areas of Bukhara still under Muslim control, outside of the talons of the Russian Czars, their situation would greatly improve. Why? The reason for this was that the Muslim authorities did not view these Russian Ashkenazim as Jews per se, but rather as Russian immigrants, and were therefore treated as any Russian immigrant. So the Muslim-controlled areas of Bukhara would grant full equal rights in commerce and residence privileges to Russian, Jewish, Ashkenazi immigrants to the Muslim-controlled areas of Bukhara. No pale of settlement, no threat of being deported anywhere. So many Ashkenazi Jews of the area migrated to the Muslim-controlled areas of Bukhara, just as Bukharian Jews living under the Muslim control were migrating in the opposite direction from the Muslim areas to the Russian-controlled areas. Fascinating. Just so no one gets confused, let me review that again. Ashkenazi Jews are immigrating from the Tsarist-controlled areas of Bukhara to the Muslim-controlled areas of Bukhara, and Bukharian Jews are migrating in the opposite direction from the Muslim-controlled areas of Bukhara to the Russian-controlled areas of Bukhara. Both groups of immigrants were migrating for the exact same reason, to improve their civil rights and their economic and financial prospects, and both succeeded in improving their civil rights and their economic and financial prospects. This fascinating microcosm provides great insight into migration trends in general in Jewish history. Without any ideology or communal infrastructure, Jews immigrate. Why do they immigrate? To better their situation. And Jews are pretty good at judging their subjective reality, which leads them to correct decisions when and where to immigrate. And there's lots to say on this topic, but I will leave it for now and move on. The Ashkenazi Jews in Bukhara identified more with Russian language and culture, and their Russian integration was therefore more rapid in these areas than in other parts of Russia. But most still identified with many of the cultural and national issues facing Russian Jewry in the Pale and as a whole, and some maintained a religious life as well. After the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union, Bukharian Jews and Ashkenazi Jews living in Bukhara now are in the communist Soviet Union. The story of Jews in Tashkent and Samarkand in Soviet Russia is fascinating on two dimensions. First of all, because maintaining Jewish life, religious life in the Soviet exile, and also Jews escaping there during the war. The area of Bukhara never fell under Nazi occupation, and therefore they were saved from the Holocaust by living in those areas, different than Georgian Jews and mountain Jews who were targeted by the Nazis during the Holocaust because those areas were occupied by the Nazis. And there's a whole question, did the Nazis consider mountain Jews Jews and racially Jews? Ultimately, the Nazis did consider mountain Jews as Jews, and many of them were killed by the SS Einsatzgruppe D, Battalion D, during the Holocaust. This was a little bit about the non-Ashkenazi Jews living in Czarist Russia in the 19th century. This is Yehuda Gerber, Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudagerber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can and should subscribe, rate, and review Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and tell your friends and family about it. Spread the word, and I hope you enjoyed.